Molly. All right, thank you and welcome back. Our next panel explores AI and military power in US-China competition, and I'm delighted that one of my favorite legal writers and thinkers, Adam White, will be moderating. Adam is the Lawrence H. Silberman Chair in Constitutional Governance and a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where his work focuses on the Supreme Court and the administrative state. He is also the co-executive director of the C. Boyd and Gray Center for the Study of the Administrative State at Antonin Scalia Law School. Adam is a member of the Administrative Conference of the United States, and he has served on the leadership councils for the administrative law sections of the American Bar Association and, most importantly, the Federalist Society. Adam, we're grateful to have you guiding this important conversation, and I'll turn things over to you.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. That was great. That's like an introduction my dad would have loved and my mom would have actually believed. That's great. I'll just say it, there's no one ever wants to follow Jamil Jaffer on stage at a conference. There's no way to follow him. But I'm still very, very glad to be here because of the three panelists that are joining me up here today for a conversation about artificial intelligence and military power in the context of US-China competition. Let me introduce our speakers very briefly, and we're going to jump right in a very conversational format. And just, I guess, in alphabetical order, sitting next to me is Dr. Ben Buchanan, former White House Special Advisor on AI. He's an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He's the author of two books. One is The Hacker and the State, Cyber Attacks and the New Normal of Geopolitics, and also The Cybersecurity Dilemma. Ben, thanks for joining us. Seated next to him in the middle is Lieutenant General Michael Gruen. Gruen. Mike is a former commander of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center. Previously, he was Deputy Chief of Computer Network Operations of the National Security Agency. He's also Director of the Marine Corps Intelligence. He served in Operation Iraqi Freedom and in Afghanistan and in the Balkans and elsewhere. His personal decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, the Bronze Star Medal, the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and the Combat Action Ribbon. And then seated next to him is McDaniel Wicker. McDaniel is Senior Vice President for U.S. Government Operations at Babel Street. What is Babel Street, you might ask? Babel Street is the global leader in mission-grade risk intelligence. Also, I like that you're the global leader in it. I mean, when I'm looking for mission-grade risk intelligence, I never want to go with second best, always the leader. Babel Street helps governments, businesses, and organizations anticipate threats, protect people, and safeguard operations with AI-powered clarity. Before joining Babel Street, McDaniel served in a variety of officer roles in the United States Air Force and the Air Force Reserve. So again, everybody, thanks for joining us today. And we're going to kick things off with a very broad question in light of the panel's subject. On a day where all day we are hearing and talking about artificial intelligence, let's start with what makes the military aspect of these things different. We're going to get very specific throughout the next hour or so, but just at a very high level of generality to situate things for this audience. How should we think about the military aspect of this? What makes that different from all of these other conversations about AI? And we'll start with General Gruen.
Great. Thank you very much, Adam. Appreciate it. So thank you, everybody. This, I think, will be a free-ranging conversation, so really looking forward to questions and a little back and forth. I think to understand where China is today, you have to kind of understand where China was, not that long ago, actually. And you actually have to understand Mao himself. So, the chairman, Mao, when he was in charge. Remember, these were the purges, and millions of people lost their lives, or at least hundreds of thousands. It was terrible famine, terribly mismanaged accountability. Yet the party survived, and that was his goal. So the Chinese Communist Party, lived through all that and succeeded. Today, you have, Xi Jinping. Xi. You have to understand this when you talk about China. He wants to stand on the pedestal next to Mao, right? And so everything he does, when he thinks at scale, when he thinks about technological, parity with the West, for example. It is all about he wants to remake the Chinese state, and he wants to put himself on that pedestal as, a great hero of the Chinese Revolution. And I think, with that in the background, you can start to see where, like, for example, the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization event, that happened a month or two ago. And at the SCO, this was a coming out party for Xi, as he stood, he didn't choose his stage mates all that well. He had, Rocket Man and Putin. But it was clear he was signaling, a new era with China at the front, and China really representing all of the nations that were not corrupt Western nations. And so, like, that geopolitical underpinning is so important, because it drives Xi, and by extension, it drives the commercial enterprises and drives the technological enterprises in China. So we're going to talk a lot about AI, and we're going to talk about these other things. And there's a lot to talk about, because China, the last thing I'll say here is, you can't think of China in the way we thought about China maybe a decade ago, right? Where we thought, well, they have lots of, ships perhaps, but they're not as good as ours. They have airplanes, not as many, but they're, we have fewer, but we have better and higher quality. Like, a lot of those sort of truisms for our relationship with China are not true anymore. And so we really have to think about a peer competitor, and what does that mean in the technological space and in the military space.
Thanks, Mike. Ben?
Yeah, I think that's exactly spot on. And I think I'll give it adjacent insight to this, which what makes AI different for the military, especially the United States military, is I would argue this is the first revolutionary technology, at least in the last 100 or so years, that the United States government, and often the United States Department of Defense, didn't have a big hand in inventing. And if you think about, of course, the atomic age, the space age, the early days of the internet, the early days of the microprocessor, GPS, all of this technology, of course, benefits from the tremendous dynamism in the American private sector that in many cases does the work. But in many cases, the original, in almost every case, the original buyer in the early days of that technology was the Department of Defense, in some cases the intelligence community. And during my 4 years in the White House, it was very clear that AI in the modern instantiation would not fit that pattern. If you go back to the 1960s, AI does fit that pattern. But the deep learning era that characterizes modern AI progress is in many respects alien to the United States government. It's in many respects alien to the Department of Defense. And we are going to have to find a way as a government to take this technology that's being invented elsewhere, bring it in to the very unique national security mission because of the high stakes that the general mentioned, and put it to use right away. That's certainly something I worked on a lot in the government that we can talk about, but it is worth, as the general said, casting our eyes to China and seeing how they do it. And I think there is remarkable advantages the United States has in AI. We have all the cards to dominate this technology in the way we dominated previous ones, but one advantage China does have is a much tighter tie between their companies and their military. And we are going to have to find a way to build a similar bridge here in order to compete in what may be the most important of new military arenas.
That's fascinating. We're definitely going to circle back to that later in the conversation. McDaniel, any opening thoughts?
Sure. Going third in this group is hard because all the good things have already been said. But a couple of other points. I think one thing that's really important about AI in the military context is the stakes. The stakes we're talking about here are lives, especially as we get into the realm of autonomous AI systems, autonomous weapon systems. The stakes are also high in the military competition with China because we're not just talking about, who has a better fighter jet. We really are kind of in that technological breakthrough, the new atomic age, the new nuclear age, and we're talking about who's going to write the rules. Who's going to write the rules for the next 50 years? What does freedom look like in a context where the U.S. doesn't win the AI race? And so I think that's one important thing to remember in terms of the military, China, and AI. Just to further kind of touch on 2 points that have already been made. One, China isn't the same China that I studied when I went into the Air Force as a second lieutenant 15 years ago. And yeah, we're better. They can't make an engine. They can't do this. They can't do that. They are leaders in AI. We are catching up to them in a lot of ways. And so I think that's important for everyone to recognize is that it's not just a peer competitor. We're chasing in a lot of areas. Also, when we talk about AI in the Chinese military, you have to realize the tighter connection between the private sector, but also the way China thinks about national security isn't as compartmented as it might be in the West and the US, where we think about military power, economic power, diplomatic power, information power. In China, they really take a whole of government approach, and all of those forms of power coalesce to help them achieve their national security aims. And that is something that has to be front of mind. And I think in a lot of ways, China already sees themselves at war with the United States, definitely in competition. And I think you could talk to plenty of people in Beijing who would say, oh yeah, we're in a fight for control of global supremacy. So that's a couple of points on the Chinese side. On the US side, absolutely there are still a ton of advantages. The things that have made the US great, our ability to innovate, our ability to create, our ability to harness US economic power, those things still exist, and we still should take advantage of those. I think what's really key is figuring out how to do public-private partnership correctly, how to leverage government-enabled technological innovation, not necessarily government-directed. I think there's an important difference there, and that's really going to be key for us to advance military uses of AI in a way that helps us continue to counter and contain China.
Now, one thing that's come up a few times through the conversation so far is just the fact that the United States and China might not be looking at the same things in the same ways, whether it's the relationship between government and the private sector. Of course, again, we'll get to that in a bit. But let's just focus on AI itself right now. In what ways does the United States and China see AI differently, whether it's politically, technologically, ethically? They're both looking at this, but they're surely not looking at it in the same way. What are the important differences? McDaniel, maybe
Sure,
I'll start with you.
I'll start. I think one important difference, as Mike alluded to earlier, is China sees AI very much as a key means to regime survival. It's about making sure the Chinese Communist Party persists. In the US, AI is obviously, it's not about ensuring the U.S. administration persists. It's about economic advancement, scientific advancement. So that's one key difference. Also, how they're tackling this problem, I think, is very different. China does have that ability to leverage that whole government approach, which gives them a lot of leeway in terms of what is considered legal in China. China actually has really great individual information protection rights with this huge, large cutout for the government. The government can still do whatever it wants with data. And the government gets to use all the data from all the state-owned enterprises to help build better AI systems, to build better models, to build better robots. And so they're able to harness a wider swath of data and talent as well. And then I think the other thing that is a key difference, right now when you talk about AI in the US, a lot of what people are talking about are large language models, LLMs, GPTs, which are extremely important to the realm of AI, but it's not all of AI, and I think China is really tackling some unique challenges. I think you see they have a big advantage in robotics, in actually operationalizing AI, putting them in the environments, creating more agentic AIs, and not just in the computerized version, but actually things that interact with the real world.
Very interesting. Mike, Ben, who wants this next?
Sure. I think right on, McDaniel. I'm with you 100%. A couple of things, maybe I would add. One is the the role of Chinese AI models now. So you've all heard of DeepSeek, of course, like in DeepSeek R1. You've probably heard of Manus, which is sort of their small agentic AI platform. The difference in the way the Chinese commercial industry looks at AI is because there's so much competition, they grab onto these small models and quickly build on them. So they like DeepSeek, for example, is an open weight model, meaning it's really easy for you to take your business use cases and load them into that model through an API so that you can then use that platform, right? In the US, our platforms are closed platforms, right? And you can still buy an API to get to them. But the difference is all of those young entrepreneurs in China they need to like pedal faster than everybody else so they can get just high enough that they start to get recognized and they start to get a market and then they take off. And so there's this incredible pressure, from entrepreneurs to like build capabilities on top of these models that like DeepSeek and some of the others. And so like it is not party directed. It is not old school communist approach to building a capability. This is entrepreneurship in a marketplace that is just going crazy right now. And so like that's a really important way to think about that, because then that extends to the rest of the ecosystem. Just this morning I was at a fusion conference, for example. And so just to talk about like fusion, like the Chinese have built, and I saw several pictures this morning of the emerging Chinese fusion platforms, and they're massive, right? And they've grown like overnight, a couple of years, but they have massive fusion centers where they'll be able to harvest like fusion energy. Fusion energy changes the planet, right? And so here they are, and we're watching them, through commercial satellite, to the degree that they know like that they're working on these all night because they can see all the welding going on at night, So like it's, it is real, and it is a present danger right in front of us. Look at the American approach to fusion energy, for example. We don't have like a civil military, commercial military set of partnerships. We have national labs that are doing some things, but we're not able to like, plug into like a large language model or one of the, the foundational models. And we don't have an effective, government and commercial interaction with that space. So like one of the things that we don't have is sort of that in the AI space is we don't have that tight integration that really drives expertise, resources, relationships with the commercial sector. We are wonderful at inventing things because we're inventors, and this is mine, and I'm going to patent it, and you can't touch it. I think that there's a completely different perspective because they have Xi's foot in their butt all the time to try to get them to think about like, okay, how do we like really dominate something as critical as as fusion energy. And I heard the litany this morning for hours about how the U.S. government is not helping and how we're not actually taking this seriously, which could be game-changing, globe-changing technology. And so I mean that's a little artifact, but I think there's probably lots of examples that follow that line.
Yeah, I'll give a piece of good news to follow up on that. I think
Please.
one key difference between the United States and China, in many respects, I think the fundamental difference between our two nations in the age of AI is our ability to dominate the chip supply chain. And semiconductors, computing power is fundamental to AI. People will obsess over data. Data is the new oil, and that is a total technical misread. For the most powerful AI systems, they follow what's called the scaling law, which, simplifying a little bit here, basically means the more computing power you use to train those systems, the more powerful the systems are as a result. And the great joy here is that the democratic governments control the computing power supply chain. Chips designed in the United States, made in Taiwan, with equipment from the United States, Japan, and the Netherlands. And the Chinese recognized this a very long time ago. Frankly, they recognized it before the US recognized it. In 2014, China said this is a giant problem. We can't make our own chips. China spent $200 billion trying to build a chip-making industry. They mostly failed. I say this as a Democrat. President Trump gets some credit in 2018 for taking a first step and cutting the Chinese off advanced chip-making equipment. In the Biden administration, we went much further. We cut them off from a bigger class of equipment and from chips themselves. You've all seen this in the news, and it's under a lot of stress right now. But this is an area of huge advantage for the United States. Even the general mentioned DeepSeek R1, which is probably the best Chinese system out there, that is trained with smuggled American chips because the Chinese simply cannot make the chips. So when we are looking for advantages to ensure American dominance of this technology, certainly my perspective, and I believe a bipartisan perspective, is because of the centrality of computing power to AI, we have an opportunity here to really lock the Chinese out from this ecosystem, and we should use that opportunity.
Could I pile on? I'll just pile on with TSMC, right? And I think everybody here is, cognizant. TSMC on Taiwan is the only place that you can build the most advanced chips. The only place. We design lots of chips. We build chips that are for special applications that don't have the same kind of horsepower. The only place in the world that we can get the greatest chips is in Taiwan. And so, our relationship with Taiwan has been really important, and it's zigged and it's zagged. We used to sell them lots of, large-scale weapon systems. Maybe that wasn't appropriate, but our equity in future chip making largely resides in Taiwan. Now, if there's a war over Taiwan, will that facility survive? I don't know. It takes lots of one-of-a-kind, pieces of equipment to actually build that capability. But I'll cut it off at this. China can't build the world's greatest chips, but they dominate global telecommunications because they can build chips that are good enough for that, right? And so that is only an obstacle, perhaps, for the sharpest edge of artificial intelligence applications.
Before you jump in, let me just add to the question, and we'll circle back to Ben after you go too, is what you just described about U.S., the West's advantage in chips. That really, at least here in the United States, seems to go against the conventional wisdom that our own domestic chip making capacity is in total disarray. Intel has been in decline now for decades. We need to subsidize this. We need to really jumpstart, kickstart, bringing companies to the United States and ideally rebooting some American companies. I'd love to hear you say a few more words about that, but first, McDaniel.
It's great because I have another supply chain related question to add back to that. So,
there we go.
I think the key thing is the West has an advantage in chips. The Netherlands, key component. Taiwan, a key component. The West, or the U.S., a key component, mainly in intellectual property and know-how. I think it's really important to understand these are not car factories. You can't build one in 6 months, no matter how much money you have. The fabs required for building chips take years. They're extremely complex, limited. So it's not like if the one in Taiwan gets bombed during an invasion, it's okay, we'll have it back up and running in Arizona in a year from now. It's just not the way it works. I thought your point about telecommunications is really good enough. China is really good at good enough. And that's actually what you see with models like DeepSeek. They're not trying to build these foundational models. They're saying, okay, well, what can I use from open source, and then I make that good enough. And then they're applying it rapidly. And that's very true in their commercial sector, but it's also very true in their military sector. And so that's why you see a lot of rapid investment, because they're not trying to make the best of the best. The U.S. and the U.S. military is really good at making exquisite weapon systems. And China is really good at making more really good systems. So yeah, the B-2 stealth bomber, nothing touches it. We saw that with the operation over Iran. But China is building enough really good weapon systems that you can negate those kind of one-to-one advantages. I also want to touch on we talked about the chip supply, and I wanted to highlight that this is actually one of the flip sides of the free economy, and the difference between China, where the whole of government, they can control what their companies do. We can't really control fully what NVIDIA does. NVIDIA has a market incentive to want to be able to sell chips to China. If they were a Chinese company, the Chinese government could easily come in and say, you're not even going to put that in the market. Like, we're going to buy all your supply. So just another key difference in the AI sphere in the US and in China. Then circling back to the supply chain question. You mentioned our advantage in chip supply, but what about at the other end of the chip supply chain, particularly rare earth minerals, and how China is trying to leverage that part of their supply chain advantage as to kind of cut off our side of the actual end product in chips?
Yeah, I'm happy to pick up some of the pieces here. I think this is a really fruitful area to dive into. It's worth laying at the outset, making advanced AI chips, other than maybe writing legal briefs, is, in my view, the most incredible thing we do as a species. This is an extraordinary technical achievement. We're talking about a process that takes a chip, maybe 2 inches by 2 inches, a little bit less than that. NVIDIA's latest chip, the B100, will fit 208 billion transistors, all intricately designed onto that tiny little chip. As all of us have mentioned, these are exclusively made in Taiwan at one company, TSMC, the only company on earth that can do that. They use an extreme ultraviolet machine from the Netherlands, the only company in the world that can make that machine that integrates thousands of suppliers, including those from the United States and Japan, to put it together. The way the machine works is it creates a vacuum 10,000 times purer than the vacuum of space. It fires a laser at molten tin 50,000 times a second, which creates a plasma, the fourth stage of matter, which emits a radiation at just the right precision that is so precise it's like hitting a golf ball on the moon with a laser pointer from Earth. And that pattern of that radiation goes onto this chip in exactly the right nanometer scale level of complexity to create this chip. This is why we can't do it in the United States, folks. This is really hard. And TSMC and the Dutch company ASML built this supply chain, built this apparatus, including with other American companies, over decades. And we are, again, the fortunate beneficiaries as democratic governments that we can control this. So I think China has a lot of things that worry me. But China's inability to do this and to indigenize this production, especially if we cut off the chip-making equipment, which we should continue to do, is really a huge advantage for the United States, given the centrality to chips in training advanced AI systems, as you can see from OpenAI and these companies spending soon to be hundreds of billions of dollars largely on buying chips. That is a huge advantage. On the NVIDIA point, I think the great news here is the United States government does have export control authority, and both the Trump administration and the Biden administration used it to say this technology is so fundamental to U.S. national security that we are not going to allow this to be sold into the Chinese market. And the good news is that the demand for chips is so extraordinarily high that every single chip that's made at TSMC will be bought and, in my view, should be bought by an American firm, given our competition. So I think there's a lot there that comes, a lot of strategic benefit that comes once you understand the technical complexity at the core of AI training.
That's fascinating. Mike, anything you want to add on supply chains or on the chips?
Well, only we disapproved, I think the president disapproved, a tranche of funding for Taiwanese military for self-defense purposes. I think it's the first time we've actually not given them, usually we have a deal, we give them money, they buy American equipment with that money. We didn't do that this year, and so I think that sets a really bad precedent.
I'm interested to see now that China has kind of doubled down on kind of trade war, if Trump actually goes back on that and puts that back on the table. One other quick point on TSMC, and only because I think it has particular relevance to lawyers and people writing law and upholding the law. TSMC in Taiwan builds these chips because the founder of the company was working in America and decided he couldn't have the opportunity that he wanted to, and he moved back home to Taiwan and started this world-beating company. So the laws we write, the laws we enforce, and the economic realities that we create in the U.S. have implications around the world. I think TSMC is one example of the talent, of that kind of talent paradigm. You also see that a lot with good talent actually going back to China. People who have come back, who have spent decades in the U.S., and going back to China to work with the CCP. Some of that is because they have been bought by the Chinese Communist Party. Some of it is just because they have the ability to do what they're passionate about. And I think that's a really delicate balance that the U.S. has to figure out, is how do we balance national security needs and the potential threat posed by Chinese operatives versus being an open, dynamic society that builds the best things possible in the world.
And last point, I know I heard in an interview in the last week or so, somebody pointed out that on the original, I guess, published research papers related to DeepSeek, none of the named authors was educated in the United States, and the Chinese officials were taking great pride in the fact that this was not sort of an offshoot of the American educational system. But that's an observation. I have a different question.
Before we move on to talent, I want to dig in one point on talent. This is really important. We cannot underestimate China's talent in artificial intelligence. So a lot of people discovered DeepSeek for the first time in 2025 when they did the R1. They're 2 years late. The DeepSeek paper that really put them on certainly the White House's radar was in November of 2023 when they did DeepSeek Code, which also had no American-educated people on it. DeepSeek is an extraordinarily talented company. They do not lack for money. They do not lack for brains. As their CEO said, the only thing that holds them back is chips. The United States is also extraordinarily talented when it comes to AI, if we get the world's talent. We noticed that there was a study in 2022 that was very impactful in our thinking in the White House, which showed that of the top 100 AI scientists in the United States by citations, 70 of them were born outside the United States. The way the United States can compete with a nation that's 4 or 5 times bigger in China that produces far more engineering PhDs per year than we do is we take the best talent from around the world, which wants to come here, and we put them to work at our companies and our defense apparatus. I hear the counterintelligence concerns. I think they're very important. But the talent equation is certainly vital here, and it is not one that is built into American advantage, if only for the size differential.
Just on a question that's occurred to me through the last part of the conversation, so much of it reminds me of the book that I know all three of you are surely familiar with, and maybe others are too, the new book, Breakneck by Dan Wong, former longtime analyst at Gavical Economic Consultants, and now he's at the Hoover Institution. And the basic premise of the book and a bumper sticker is China is a society of engineers, America is a society of lawyers, and of course here in this room we say, yay, lawyers. We have our pros and cons. And Dan's, the argument in the book is we've made it so hard in America to build anything, whether it's companies or factories, and he does a deep dive into the differences between the US and China. My question is this, and I think he's gotten this question in a few places. It's not clear whether this difference between the United States and China, the engineering mindset, all the way up to the social engineering of the government versus the lawyer mindset, is whether it is ideological or cultural, or if it's just situational. It's just the fact that America used to be a nation of engineers too. All the kids on farms that went on to create things like Intel. I'm just curious. Do any of you have any sort of thoughts on that? On why China is so different from us in this respect? Is it ideological, or is it situational? Cultural, something else? I'm just springing this on you.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and it's important once again to get the reality, get the real China in your head, right? Because, for example, China, their demographics are plummeting. I think everybody's aware of that, and so the one-child policy now is come and due, right? And so the one child's they don't want to have children, or they're too busy. There's an issue there with demographics and families and society. There's an issue with like stateless persons, that is people who don't have a hometown, right? A hoku. And so they don't have a hoku, which if you have a hoku, that means you're entitled to go to the medical center in your village or the hospital in your city. It allows you to get a job or a license to open a restaurant or what have you. So like 300 million-ish Chinese citizens are not really citizens. They're peasants that live and farm out in the hinterlands. And that is a huge drag on the productivity of the Chinese nation. And I would add one more thing here. There is, on the order of 150, 200 million temporary workers, right? So they do gig jobs, gig workers. So they'll work at a factory for a day, then they'll take a day off and hang out with their friends. They'll go work at a restaurant for a week. They'll 5 of them live in an apartment. It's like it's like, and these are all like college age kids, but the economy, like the availability of like long-term good jobs for sort of middle-class Chinese young people is almost non-existent. And so you have this huge issue with, not only a declining demographic, but a youthful populace that is somewhat disturbed by the fact that they can't get real jobs and kind of like, buy a house, which is the objective of every Chinese family. And so like there's some real deep, underneath the drive of the Communist Party and the great institutions that they have and the Chinese mastery of, almost every physical science. There are some real issues. I don't know if you've seen like the Stanford report that describes globally and they have about 200 different sciences and technologies that they list in their report, and they do this every year. And on that list of hundreds of technologies, China is number one in almost every one, and like all but like two. And I think we have one of those, and there might be some other flag on there. But if you look at that, I mean, most of the world, the balance of scientific education and expertise, China's first, we are second, and then also ran. So, I mean, there's some deep-seated issues in China and Chinese society as well. The focus and the power of the Chinese Communist Party to say, yeah, gig workers, sit down, build that fusion plant. You know what I mean? Like that, their ability to do both of those things, I think, gives them a power that we don't seem to have or don't govern that way.
Great. Ben McDaniel, you want to jump on this?
Yeah, I think I'm not smart enough to figure out the cultural dynamics at the core of it. I think the journal made a lot of excellent points here about the bifurcation within China, the hundreds of millions of people in China who don't have a high school degree and the drag that creates on the economy, the youth unemployment, the increasing Chinese trend called laying flat, basically not participating in the economy because of the strenuous nature of what's expected of them. So China has real structural problems. But to the engineering mindset, I think a great example that shows the difference between the two nations is on energy production. Now, if chips are the most important thing in AI, which I think they are, if talent is second, which I think it is, then third is energy production. You need the energy to run the chips, and that's why all these AI companies are trying to build these giant multi-gigawatt data centers. OpenAI talking about a 10-gigawatt data center by 2027 or 2028. That's the entire energy production of dozens of U.S. states are less than 10 gigawatts. This is an area where China is crushing the United States in energy production. And frankly, I think part of the reason the United States is lagging behind energy production is because we've lost the muscle to build things. From 2005 to 2021, the net new power of the United States grew 0.1% per year. Picked up a little bit under Biden with the bipartisan infrastructure law and the like, but still nowhere near what China is doing. China added solar energy to the grid last year that is equivalent to 15% of the energy on Earth. So they added extraordinary amounts of new power, largely solar, which is very cheap right now, to their grid. Solar gigawatt farms pushing towards tens and eventually hundreds of gigawatts at a time when the United States is retrenching and cutting its energy production. The White House just canceled a 6-gigawatt solar project in Nevada, canceled some of the largest transmission lines in the United States. So if we sit here in 3 or 4 years and say, wow, we've really lost our edge in AI, one reason is we sold the Chinese chips they couldn't make. The second reason is we kicked out talent we should have kept. And the third reason is the Chinese, probably because of their engineering mindset, built a lot of power. And because of our legal or political mindset, we refuse to do the same.
Not to throw myself in as a panelist, but I'll just say, in 2005, that's when I started my career as an energy infrastructure lawyer in D.C., where I basically spent most of my days grappling with the National Environmental Policy Act. And I wish if they ever create time machines, I will go back to 2005 and say, it'd be nice if we could build some natural gas pipelines in this country and any other form of energy infrastructure. But we've managed to train ourselves to block that for the last 4 or 5 decades. And I think it is useful now that there's a bipartisan coalition of folks who want to support energy production, and I'm a big fan of what's called the abundance movement, but that's now digging out of a 40 years deep cultural hole in terms of how we think about whether or not we're going to allow anything to be built in America. That's just my stump speech, and I'm sorry.
With respect to power, I think there are some people that hate wind, they hate solar, there are some people that love nuclear, and natural gas is king. But honestly, it's not a question of which ones do we choose. Right. We need all of them at max capacity right now, and that's only growing. God help us, we need the first modular fusion reactor to actually really turn this energy, the risk that we have into something real.
Dan, you got anything else on this, or I'll go to the next question?
Yeah, I'll just add, when I was studying in China and studying China, one of the key differences that always struck me was China is a country of law, but it's rule by law. We're a rule of law here. It's really important. That's why lawyers are so important in the U.S. because of the legal underpinnings of the freedoms we enjoy, the legal underpinnings of the economic success that we're be able to build. I think really more than lawyers, we're a society of entrepreneurs and business people, and the law is just so fundamental to that, private property and things like that. And so that's where I see the bigger difference, less so than engineers versus lawyers, rule of law, rule by law. I do think one point that has come up is we have to be bold. I don't think we've been bold in a long time. We have to be willing to risk things. We have to be willing to fail. I think that's true from a regulation standpoint. Whether that's the environmental protection laws, whether that's all sorts of kind of introducing new technologies, whether it's nuclear, whatever it might be. We have to be willing to step out. I think it's hugely important for AI. It's kind of an unknown. How is it going to impact people's lives, livelihoods? How is it going to impact people's privacy? Lots of questions there that we could be very cautious about, and it's going to impede development. I think it's also true in our military, and I think oftentimes you see military leaders who are rewarded for not taking risk. They play it safe, they keep their head down, and things are good. And at this stage of competition, kind of going back to the theme of the panel, military competition with China, at this stage of competition with China, I think we have to be willing to think outside the box. I think we have to reward military leaders who challenge the status quo and push us forward, because that's what's going to happen as China is a peer competitor and in some ways outpaces us.
All of our leaders were told to get their hair cut and lose some weight.
It's good.
So is that about the same? Yeah.
This is great. We're all going to start doing push-ups right on stage.
Yeah.
But I have another question. And we've touched on this a little bit here and there. This relationship between the government and the industry, right? Obviously, this is one of the places where the United States and China differ the most. And so far, we've spoken of it mostly in terms of the great advantages that China has in being able to just direct industry in one direction, subsidize it, limit its operations commercially elsewhere. Of course, the great advantage of the United States, as McDaniel just said, is the fact that we aren't a country like that, where we do have limited government. We have a thriving private sector precisely because it's not driven into the ground by the government. One of the reasons why Ronald Reagan and Pat Moynihan and others could be confident that the United States was going to win the Cold War was precisely because we're not a communist dictatorship. And so as we think about the relationship between the government and the private sector, the way China approaches it and ours, are there changes that we need to make on our side to better compete with China on this issue? And if so, how do we avoid that risk of actually just undermining ourselves? I can't remember if there's a columnist at the Wall Street Journal, I think Greg Ip coined the term communism, Chinese communism with American characteristics, right? This notion that if we pursue industrial policy too aggressively, we're just going to accidentally imitate the mistakes of China. This is now a question in the form of a statement, but I'm just curious, what reforms, if any, should we make in the United States to this relationship between the public and private sectors, and how do we make sure that we protect what's uniquely American about America? Yeah. Ben, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think we've talked about some with the streamlining of power and permitting here in the United States. Yeah. President Biden signed a second AI executive order to do that. It's since been repealed as well, but I think there should be bipartisan agreement on that kind of permitting reform. We've talked about talent. Those are the two obvious ones. And I think an area we haven't touched on as much, and certainly fits right in the Journal's experience, is getting the Department of Defense and the intelligence community to adapt to this technology. And this is something where President Biden signed a national security memorandum, basically an order to the Department of Defense and the intelligence community to try to drive this adoption. It built heavily on the work that the General did when he was at the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center, which became the Chief Data and AI Office at the Pentagon. But candidly, I think this is an area where the United States government really fell behind in adapting technology from the private sector, recognizing its utility to the national security mission. And if we don't get better at that, we will fail. One, I think, really concrete example of this is the use of AI in cyber operations. There's no doubt, I think, that cyber operations are a fundamental tool of national power, offensive and defensive operations, espionage and attack. And there's no doubt at this point that AI offers tremendous promise to both the offense and the defense. If you look at, for example, the work that Anthropic, an AI company, has put out recently regarding the capabilities out of the box of their Claude system in vulnerability discovery and the like, current capabilities, I think, are unmistakable, and the trajectory is even more obvious. We need to find a way to bring those systems onto classified networks, integrate them into American operations, and ensure that we are bringing our best fight to the fight, because you can be sure the Chinese are going to do that. I would say this was an area that where a lot of people have pushed for a long time. We pushed for 4 years in the White House, and I worry in the era of haircuts and the like, we're taking our eye off the ball of where the next war is going to be won.
Yeah. Thanks, Ben. Mike?
Yeah, I would start with, you mentioned McDaniel, you mentioned Ben, sort of like the Pentagon, not thinking outside the box. There is certainly an element of truth to that, but the problem is much larger than that. The fierce tribalism within our government is absolutely creates absolute dysfunction, right? So the military services, each have their own cylinders and they jealously guard their money. They may extend a hand through the net, and maybe shake a sailor's hand once, and then come back again. But this idea of this fierce tribalism, because there's not real accountabilities for getting things done, right? And in AI, this, my experience is a little dated now because the technology is moving so fast. But, it was almost impossible to get, an Army organization and a Navy organization to think together about like how to solve, problems. There were a myriad of, innovation cells and like special units that were stood up. But none of them really had like real deep backing of the state, inside DoD. And so there were lots of folks who thought, well, the solution is then we just need to parachute tech bros, into the Pentagon, and everything will be fine, right? Because these guys will code this up in an afternoon, and everything will be cool. The problem with that is the tech bros know nothing about warfighting. And warfighting is where the processes and the flow and the data flow, the effects, the management of effects, like all those things flow through processes inside the Department of Defense. We've never actually really like anchored tech bros and functional experts at the lowest levels who can actually walk the dog on, hey, I'm an artilleryman. Let me show you how artillery works. And this is how we do it today. And these are the inputs to our process. And this is the tech that we use. And then have somebody, of a tech bent to actually come in and say, you know what, you need our X100, that's going to do it for you. Like we don't have those kind of relationships. It's stilted, it's stovepiped, it's tribal, and it can really sap the energy out of you, when you're trying to get things across the finish line inside the Department of Defense. The thing that's missing is accountability. Right? Like accountability. I'm not asking you to do this. Do this, and I'm going to measure you on how you did that. Yeah, but no, none of that, right? Like we have to be much more directive, which means you have to empower leaders inside the organization. Means you have to let the leaders have some control over the bureaucracy inside the Pentagon, because the uniformed folks kind of like rise on the top of the crust, right? Because the bureaucracy is so deep, right, and so meshed that it's really hard to break through. So there are some like real things that we could do. They're social things. They're efficiency things. Doge is not the right way to do it, but something like Doge, that actually considers like accountabilities for things, for outcomes. There's a lot of room for that inside the department today.
Mike, I guess I'm very glad that Palantir hired Mike Gallagher, not just because he's a former congressman, but he's also a former Marine. So
yeah,
they've got that covered.
Yeah.
McDaniel?
Yeah, Palantir is a good example of, I think, some things that are going right in the U.S. If you go back a decade plus, there was a real tension between Silicon Valley and the U.S. government. A lot of tech companies really didn't want to, that military stuff, that's not for us. You can go work with traditional players like Booz Allen. You had Google pull out of Maven. You had some other issues where the leaders in technology and AI weren't. I think you've seen that really turn in the last few years. I think Palantir is a great example of that. They're kind of the one that's gone full tilt and said, no, we're leaning hard into this, and we're going to bring AI development that have mission impacts. So I think that's really encouraging. I think we need more of that. We definitely need more of that collaboration between government and industry, where industry says, hey, I know tech really well, and the government says, well, I know the mission really well. Okay, how do we get mission and technology together? And part of that is just trust. One of the things, I run a sales team. That's what I do. I sell AI to the government. And one of the things that I struggle with when I go talk to people is they say, well, how do I trust this? How do I trust this AI process? How do I trust this data process? And we need more companies that can be trusted mission partners that are willing to explain the technology, willing to be open kimono and say, hey, this is how it works, this is what we're doing. We also need government partners that say, hey, this is what I need. Don't have industry develop in a black box, but have something that you can actually have a good conversation back and forth. And then have good streamlined processes to actually acquire that. And because we're commercial entities, we have to pay the bills and the shareholders, and that's just the way it works. We don't need to imitate China and their mistakes. There's plenty of mistakes with their state-owned enterprises. Even DeepSeek, General, you talked about the incredible competition sphere in China at the lower levels, and there absolutely is this roiling sea of entrepreneurs trying to make a name for themselves. Ben, you mentioned that DeepSeek really started getting known in AI circles back in 2023, and it's actually very interesting that since they came out with their big splashy thing earlier this year, the Chinese Communist Party has actually taken a much stronger interest. They've actually come in and started saying, hey, you need to do this for the state, and you've actually seen their development slow down, because there are mistakes with the Chinese model. We don't want state-directed advancement, we want state-enabled advancement. So let's let the U.S. government do what it does really well, which is the military side of things, that hard power, and also writing a check. The money of the U.S. government is really important.
All right, Daniel, let's stick with you for a moment. You just described one major change in the last 10 years. As I understand it, Ash Carter, when he was Secretary of Defense, deserves a lot of credit for trying to rebuild relationships with, between Washington and Silicon Valley. You've seen this flourishing of companies, not just Palantir, but Andrew and others, Andreessen Horowitz and others have entire verticals focused on this sector now. And I think yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, Jamie Dimon had an op-ed saying that JP Morgan is redoubling its efforts both on the energy infrastructure development side and also on national security tools. So in terms of this flourishing of private sector interest in America's geopolitical position, that's changed a lot. My question is, what else has changed in the last 10 years? What other important trends have we seen in the last 10 years that are moving in the right direction or maybe the wrong direction?
That was my answer to that pre-prepared question. So I think, obviously, the state of technology has changed. I think that's a given. I also think the thing that's changed probably the most is a recognition across the country of we're not in the post-Cold War Pax Americana age anymore. There are real security challenges that have real implications for everyday Americans, and we either have to get on board with that and figure out how we remain the preeminent power in the world, or we have to be willing to accept that China is going to write some of the rules in the world economy. And so I think that has really shifted how both the government and the industry are approaching things.
Let's bingo next, and Mike, I'm going to reframe the question for you a little bit. Okay.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this technology thread, because it's a truism to say that technology has changed a lot in the last 10 years, changed a lot in the last 10 months. But I want to pull out why it's changing and what we can learn from that to see what comes next. So I've talked before about the importance of computing power in driving technological change. That will continue. The important thing to recognize is that is an exponential. We are using exponentially more computing power because the chips themselves, due to Moore's law, are getting exponentially more powerful. The companies on top of that first exponential are spending exponentially more money to train their AI systems because the capital markets are now making that money available. Something like GPT-2, which came out in 2019, probably cost on the order of magnitude of $10,000 or $100,000 to train. GPT-3 probably was low millions, GPT-4 substantially more. Now, it wouldn't surprise me if you see in 2026 single AI systems that cost something like $1 billion to train, or high hundreds of millions of dollars to train for a single system. Again, exponentially more money going in to exponentially better chips. Also, exponentially better algorithms. So we're getting more efficient in the algorithmic development that's part of the AI training process, which compounds on this all further. So where I think all this adds up is, unless you are obsessed with AI And unless you are spending your days really tracking AI progress, for example, you perceived the progress that Anthropic made with their 4.5 system that came out a week or two ago. Unless you are spending that amount of time paying attention to it, you are almost certainly underestimating the technology and where this is going. Because there's enough exponentials that show no signs of slowing that we should expect to see really extraordinary capabilities within a short period of time. And I think the term artificial general intelligence is really not terribly useful. But if you look, for example, at AI's capacity to aid scientific discovery, to aid AI research, these are not hypotheticals at this point. And probably the most significant data point from 2025 on technology is one that almost no one noticed, which is a paper from Google earlier this year called Alpha Evolve, which used a very powerful AI system to help optimize the process of AI development. And in AI development, one of the algorithms we use is matrix multiplication. Humans, which is essentially a math operation, humans thought we had figured out how to do matrix multiplication. We had the same way of doing it for the last 56 years, and this AI system found a way to do it 23% faster. A core fundamental part of the math of training AI systems is now substantially faster as a result of AI. That is the power of the exponential. We are still very early in it, but if you look at what's happened in the last 10 years and how the exponential has begun to grow, I think it tells us a lot about what's coming next.
Mike, in terms of recent trends, one trend I'm very worried about, and we've just touched on it a little while ago, is Taiwan. It seems that the threat around Taiwan is only increasing. China seems more and more interested in threatening an attack, whether or not it's actually going to invade. And at the same time, in the United States, the trend is in the other direction. As a country, we seem more and more ambivalent about our previous commitments to Taiwan. So should I be that worried about this, or am I misreading the situation?
You should be that worried about this, because I think it's very clear. I mean, with Taiwan, like we said before, I mean, because it is a singularity right now, right? Like it is the only place that you can build those chips. TSMC is building a new facility. Intel is back in the game. A couple of other chip makers are out there, at smaller scale. But TSMC, for the foreseeable future, for years, I mean, even if we started today, for years will be the source of chips. And kind of hearkening to my earlier conversation or comments about Xi, for Xi, I think the way he talks, Taiwan is a legacy issue for him. And for him to be on the pedestal next to Mao and the great heroes of the Chinese Communist Party, Mao is there and Xi is just beside himself to get on that pedestal. And I think he will do whatever he needs to do. And I think so that when you have a leader that's driven and is basically a leader for life, it makes them do things, right? Like there are and not all of them are bad. I mean, he's making, the accountability within the Chinese Communist Party, for example, is much better than it ever was because he's calling people out. All of the corruption, all of the dysfunction inside the CCP, like he's actually cleaning that all up, which is great for him, not so great for us. So I think that there's that's an opponent that we have to watch carefully because it's very clear what their agenda are and what the risks are if we don't kind of meet them where they are. I would, looking inside, I mentioned, fusion earlier today, and, I've got fusion on the brain today, but, here's a perfect example of the inability of the U.S. government, and to bring together a consortium of, there's all kinds of commercial industries that want to invest in fusion, right? And so, and there are, national laboratories that want to invest in fusion. There's resources in the marketplace to invest in fusion, but we just can't get ourselves together enough to actually create a program, get a blessing on it, get a roadmap, and actually execute. We really fail at execution. Some of that is because of a 4-year cycle, but we just don't have sort of that staying power as a nation to pick the things that are really important and then actually follow through on their execution.
Ben, were you about to jump in?
No, I couldn't agree more.
Great.
Every word of it.
So, if anybody wants to ask a question, you know how it works, folks. Make your way to the microphone, and while they're making their way, I'll just ask one more quick question, and it builds on that last point. We have elections every 2 or 4 or 6 years for a reason. Part of our the democratic system is not having one group in power for too long, but it does seem to put us at a strategic disadvantage where China can look out over the course of years, decades, or more. Is there a way for the United States to productively sustain strategy across administrations, or are we just sort of stuck with this kind of whiplash from one administration to the next? Although I will point out on China, there's been a lot of consistency, it seems, from the Trump to Biden to Trump administrations, and maybe this will just carry on. Ben?
Well, I worry we are losing that bipartisan consensus. So I agree there was that bipartisan consensus. As I said, I think President Trump gets a lot of credit for what he did in 2018 and 2019 to cut off a particular kind of advanced chip-making equipment to China. We expanded that tremendously in the Biden administration. I worry that we are seeing a backsliding on that with China policy, and that, you know, maybe the Chinese are going to make it hard here with their own belligerence, but that we would see some kind of deal that would I think undermine a lot of American advantages. So I think there was a bipartisan consensus, and I think we should all work to maintain that, because these are fundamentally not partisan issues. These are issues of national security.
Anyone else on this, or should we go to the audience? Go ahead, Mike.
Rare earth elements and rare earth minerals, and the 0.01% now control that the Chinese Communist Party has for any component, any device, anything that has more than 0.01% rare earth elements in it now is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. I think that that's a negotiating tactic, so that when the president, when our president gets there, that they've got something to give. But it just kind of makes you sit up straight, like, okay, do they actually have that much of a stranglehold on our ability to develop advanced technology? And if so, then we need to do something about that.
Just really quick on this, Mike. They have the resources in the ground and they dig them out of the ground, but do they have a monopoly on the capacity for actually refining them into useful things like magnets, or is that outside of China?
I don't know where it all is, and a lot of those places that are being developed are not in China, right? So like Chile, for example, has got all kinds of minerals, and so there are places that the Chinese like own the mining facilities and that sort of thing.
We spent a lot of time on this in 22 because we were worried this would be an area of Chinese retaliation, and the Chinese industry is very robust because it's a very dirty process and they're comfortable with those environmental harms, but this is nowhere near as hard to build as a chip-making industry. And if China wants to use their leverage in this way, it will be very short-sighted, and I think we tried to convey that to them, and they didn't do it with us. And we should reaffirm that we are not going to be bullied in this way, and if we need to move rare earth supply chains elsewhere, other parts of the earth, including the United States, have extraordinary amounts of lithium and the like.
Interesting. McDaniel?
Yeah, exactly.
On the question of whiplash, I think it's something, it doesn't have to be that way. And it doesn't just have to be that way based on if we all agree and kind of keep focused. I think if we remain a country rule of law, that helps. We set the law, but also realize that America's power isn't the government, it's everything else that we bring to bear. Then that will help us as well. Even as there might be political whiplash, society can continue to develop and march forward and maintain our strength.
That's great. Thanks, and thank you guys for your patience. Why don't you introduce yourself and ask the first question?
Hi, I'm Brian Scala. Thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. My question is, why, when we're trying to build up our own industry, why aren't we also focusing on the good enough chips that China's making? For example, we're building the TSMC facility, but there's no foundation behind it. I haven't seen anything to suggest that we're also building up kind of the 5 or 10-year-old microchip plants. And is there a way that we could change our thinking of that? And then as a corollary to that, have our companies and industries gotten too reliant on government solutions to any of these problems, especially since probably the financial crisis and the Detroit bailout, where with the rare earths, if China's going to cut them off and our American companies need them, why can't the government then just turn around and say, if you need these products, you develop them? you have this investment capital. So is there a whole fundamental change that we need to do, or can this be done incrementally?
Great questions. Who's first? McDaniel, I feel like you've been last on a few of these rounds. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think part of this goes back to things we've touched on a few times. We could have a rare earth industry in the U.S. and in the West. Regulation and some conscious decisions not to do that because of how dirty it can be have prevented us from doing it. But as Ben mentioned, it's not insurmountable. It's probably a challenge that can be solved in a matter of months, not a matter of years. So that is true. I think your other question about what about the good enough? I think there are a lot of companies that focus on good enough. I think Battle Street, my company, makes a great product. We're definitely not NVIDIA making the best chips, nor are we.
I was told you were the global leader.
Global leader in information intelligence, that's true, but not in building foundational models. I think there's also a tendency in the U.S. to chase the shiny penny. And I think that's what we see a lot of right now with people. Again, going back to what something I said earlier, if you say AI in the U.S., you mean LLMs, because that's the shiny penny. And so I think that gets a lot of the attention. I think it does get a lot of the investment, both from the government and from private capital. And we could do a better job about some rational planning, not picking winners and losers, but having a better environment where other options can succeed.
Anyone else?
Go ahead. I'll just real quickly, when we said we were not going to send GPUs, the NVIDIA chips, to China, then we offered, Jensen Huang and the president and others talked about, okay, wait a minute, maybe the right thing to do is like habituate them to our chips so that, they become dependent on us. Mm-hmm. And, we were moving in that direction. And then the Chinese threw a wild card down and said, hey, we were offering them H20 chips, which were, a couple orders down from a GPU. And the Chinese said, you know what, no, we don't want those H20s. And again, a negotiating strategy for, look, if you're not going to give us the best chips, if you're not going to sell us the best chips, then we're willing to start with the best that we have and kind of like work up from there. So I think that there's a lot of drama left in there, but there's been this, negotiation tactics of, well, we're going to give you, GPUs. We don't want them. Well, we'll give you H20s. Well, we already can, we'll make H20s on our own. So like you see the elements of a trade negotiation kind of starting to emerge, in the early phases here.
Yeah, let's dive into this good enough question. I think there's a lot here. So let's just be precise on what China can actually do, and we can decide if it's good enough. President Trump's team, Secretary Lutnick, testified earlier this year that China can make 200,000 chips. They're talking about the Huawei 910C chip, which is about 60% as good as the NVIDIA chip, the H100 from 2022. China can make 200,000 of those across the whole country in 2025, according to the Trump administration's testimony. That is not enough for a single data center. So we really need to dive into the details to recognize how bad the Chinese position is, even in a world in which our export controls on advanced chip making equipment are deeply imperfect and are being walked back. So China has had a lot of success in areas like telecom and EV and the like, but they have not been able to crack this code on chip making, even on what I would call fairly low-end chips. So I think there's an extraordinary advantage here the United States has on all elements of the chip stack. I think the H20 is substantially better than what China could do. I spent 4 years trying to get that chip not sold to China. So I think there's a lot there that we have. The second good enough question that we get a lot is what about good enough AI? And what about DeepSeek and the like? And here I think AI systems are fundamentally different than many other industries where we're used to Chinese undercutting, like telecoms and EVs and the like. In AI, we have something called distillation, where if you have a very powerful AI system, you can use that very powerful system to distill a smaller, cheaper, but more capable AI system. So the reason why I think DeepSeek ultimately will not be that competitive on a multi-year basis is they will not be able to get the chips to train the frontier system, and American companies that do have frontier systems will distill cheaper versions from them. And if you look at what American companies are doing, it's exactly this. Google has Gemma, Microsoft has Phi, Anthropic has the Haiku models, OpenAI has their open source system from August. All of these on the merits are outperforming DeepSeek already and will continue to do so because of the dynamic in which the frontier is so important. This is unique to AI. This is unique to the technical characteristics of AI. You don't see this in handbags. You don't see this in telecoms. You don't see it in EV. But if we're trying to master US-China tech competition, we got to get the tech details right.
Right. We have 2 questions left, and we have time for 2 questions. So why don't we ask both questions, and then we'll let the 3 panelists respond to them all at the same time.
Great. Thank you. Great panel. Bonnie Wachtel. My question is about the willingness and the likelihood of the U.S. stepping up to the challenge. And in this question, I'm only focusing on the issue of energy. I'm too polite to ask you to acknowledge this, but my own observation is that the problems that we've had in energy here are very much tied to the incredibly effective yet insidious narrative that's been pushed about climate change and its hostility to fossil fuel, natural gas, and nuclear. Well, with the advent of AI, as you said in the last year, that's over. I mean, every major tech company is now focused on energy, the abundance movement, as you say, all of the above. So with that, and they're apparently a lot more powerful than anybody else pushing this politically. So with that in focus, it is my understanding the United States is the Saudi Arabia of natural gas. There's no reason we can't put up nuclear plants very quickly, as they've done in Canada and France, if we have the will to do so. Personally, I'd have to say I predict that we're going to be all over this ahead, everything we need, or at least equal to China, within the next 18 months. And would you care to comment?
Right. And the next question. Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you. Tate Kaufman from Scalia Law. At the midpoint in the conversation, you folks addressed some of the human capital issues at hand here, specifically talent leakage between the United States and China. But I was wondering specifically, what are your thoughts on the recent adjustments to the H-1B visa, and what challenges will that pose to the U.S. Getting the appropriate talent? Does that just sort of separate the wheat from the chaff, or is that going to be a real issue going forward? Thank you.
These are great. And we'll just start with Ben, and we're going to go right down the row. Energy policy and immigration policy vis-a-vis everything we've discussed.
Yeah, I wish I shared the optimism on energy. I was hopeful this was an area where we could see a continuation. I think we've seen a regression. You have President Trump's science advisor talking about training AI systems and running AI data centers with coal-fired power plants. That is simply not realistic. I would be in favor of building an all-the-above energy strategy. The natural gas supply chains over the next couple of years are limited by turbine production. The opportunity for us to grow on that with advanced geothermal, small modular nuclear reactors, and solar and wind is where we can really capture a lot of the upside in the 18, 24-month timeframes. It hasn't happened. We are going the wrong direction. It is not just on the energy side of things where we've seen the cancellation of large projects, but it's also on transmission, which is fundamental because the data centers are often in different locations from the power plants for data center siting reasons we don't need to go into, and on interconnection, the process of adding new energy to the grid. When you build a power plant, that's not enough. There's a process called interconnection to actually connect it. That takes a long time. That's gone slower. So I was extremely hopeful on this point, and frankly, I think the rhetoric has been pretty good in some cases of American energy AI dominance, but I am profoundly disappointed by the execution of actually building more energy, and I would hope I'm wrong on this, and we can sit here in 3 years and say, wow, America built enough to keep up with China. I don't see it happening on the current trends. On H-1B, I think the H-1B program is something that needed reform. We, in the president's AI executive order, used that executive order to push through a lot of reforms to cut down on fraud in the program because there was a recognition of the importance of talent to AI. I don't think the additional step that the president took is the right one. If we wanted to increase to separate the wheat from the chaff, as you say, the way I would do it, if that is the overriding priority, is to sort the H-1B applications by compensation, which is the sort of gold standard way to address this. We're not doing that. So I have concerns on both fronts.
Thanks, Ben. General, and then McDaniel, you'll get the last word.
Super. Yeah, I'll go quick. I think the energy conversation is a perfect conversation, and it does seem globally that the the rationale for, sticking with clean energy and the general concern about warming of the planet, I just don't hear that much. Although the carbon markets are still operating and, people are still, fulfilling their promises, especially Korea and Japan and the Europeans. But you're right, that conversation has died away. I do think, again, with energy, like we now, modular fusion reactors are, within a decade, fission reactors, we could be building those within about 5 or 6 years. So, I mean, we have the ability to extend beyond natural gas. We are the Saudi Arabia for natural gas. But the Saudis are building solar panels and populating the desert with solar panels, right? So there's clearly a demand signal that greatly exceeds what we can do even with natural gas. And so I think we just have to, it really is fire on all cylinders. And then let's see what the world consensus is on protecting the environment.
Thanks. Thanks, General. Finally, McDaniel.
I am cautiously optimistic on the energy front. I'm not an energy expert, but the conversation around nuclear and kind of the change in tenor around that, I think is extremely encouraging. I've always been a fan of nuclear power. It is both clean, it is both very safe, and we can do it here in the U.S. So I don't know why we haven't been for a long time. Hopefully, now that industry is kind of coming around, we can see some meaningful changes. There is a lot of regulation that has to be fixed for that to happen. But it's the economy, stupid. And if the economic realities are that we need more energy, we need it faster, I think that even Washington can find a way to make that happen. On the talent question, I do not know the ins and outs of the H-1B visa or the visa reform, but I know it is fundamental to American success that we continue to capture the best talent available. Some of that is Chinese, but it's also from the rest of the world. It's from Europe, it's from Canada, it's from India, and we need to have a big, beautiful door in whatever wall we build to make sure we get the best talent in here. And that's what's made us successful, whether that's, Carnegie building steel plants, whether it's the millions of immigrants that have come in and built the country that we know. We want people coming in. We want them buying into what America is, buying into the truths that we hold to, the freedoms of the Constitution. But we want them coming in and not staying out, building a better future in their country.
Great. And speaking of getting the best talent in, please join me in thanking our speakers. Next, Caroline, shake me off if I'm wrong here, but next panel is 15 minutes on AI and information. 30 minutes. Boy, have fun, folks.